The Indonesian-Malaysian confrontation or Borneo confrontation was a violent conflict from 1963 to 66 that stemmed from Indonesia's opposition to the creation of Malaysia. The creation of Malaysia was the amalgamation of the Federation of Malaya, Singapore and the Crown Colony, British Protectorates of North Borneo and Sarawak in September 1963. Important precursors to the conflict included Indonesia's policy of confrontation against Netherlands New Guinea from March-August 1962 and the Brunei Revolt in December 1962. The confrontation was an undeclared war, with most of the action occurring in the border area between Indonesia and East Malaysia on the island of Borneo. The conflict was characterized by restrained and isolated ground combat, set within tactics of low-level brinkmanship. Combat was usually conducted by company or platoon-sized operations on either side of the border. Indonesia's campaign of infiltrations into Borneo sought to exploit the ethnic and religious diversity in Sabah and Sarawak compared to that of Malaya and Singapore, with the intent of unraveling the proposed state of Malaysia. The challenging jungle terrain of Borneo and lack of roads straddling the Malaysia-Indonesia border forced both Indonesian and Commonwealth forces to conduct long foot patrols. Both sides relied on light infantry operations and air transport, although Commonwealth forces enjoyed the advantage of better helicopter deployment and resupply to forward operating bases. Rivers were also used as a method of transport and infiltration. Although combat operations were primarily conducted by ground forces, aerial forces played a vital support role and naval forces ensured the security of the sea flanks. The British provided most of the defensive effort, although Malaysian forces steadily increased their contributions, and there were periodic contributions from Australian and New Zealand forces within the combined Far East Strategic Reserve stationed then in West Malaysia and Singapore. Initial Indonesian attacks into East Malaysia relied heavily on local volunteers trained by the Indonesian Army. With the passage of time, infiltration forces became more organized with the inclusion of a larger component of Indonesian forces. To deter and disrupt Indonesia's growing campaign of infiltrations, the British responded in 1964 by launching their own covert operations into Indonesian Kalimantan under the codename Operation Claret, coinciding with Sukarno announcing "Year of Dangerous Living" and the 1964 race riots in Singapore. Indonesia launched an expanded campaign of operations into West Malaysia on 17 August 1964, albeit without military success. A build-up of Indonesian forces on the Kalimantan border in December 1964 saw the UK commit significant forces from the UK-based Army Strategic Command, and Australia and New Zealand deployed Rule-Element combat forces from West Malaysia to Borneo in 1965–66. The intensity of the conflict began to subside following the events of the 30th of September movement and Suharto's rise to power. A new round of peace negotiations between Indonesia and Malaysia began in May 1966, and a final peace agreement was signed on the 11th of August 1966, with Indonesia formally recognizing Malaysia. Background: political situation before Indonesia's confrontation of Malaysia. Sukarno had sought to develop an independent Indonesian foreign policy, focused on the acquisition of Netherlands New Guinea as a residual issue from the Indonesian National Revolution, and establishing Indonesia's credentials as a notable international power operating distinct interests from those of the West and East. Indonesia had relentlessly pursued its claim to Netherlands New Guinea during the period 1950 to 1962. Despite facing multiple setbacks in the UN General Assembly to have its claim recognized by the international community, Indonesia was an important country in developing the non-aligned movement, hosting the Bandung Conference in 1955. Following the Indonesian crisis in 1958, which had included the Pemesta Rebellion in eastern Indonesia and the declaration of the PRRI, a rebel revolutionary government based in Sumatra, Indonesia had emerged as a notable and rising military power in Southeast Asia with the influx of Soviet arms aid. Indonesia was able to advance its diplomatic claims to Netherlands New Guinea more forcefully. The diplomatic dispute reached its climax in 1962 when Indonesia launched a substantial campaign of airborne and seaborne infiltrations upon Netherlands New Guinea. While the infiltration forces were soundly defeated by Dutch and indigenous forces, Indonesia was able to lend credence to the threat of an Indonesian invasion of Netherlands New Guinea. The Dutch, facing mounting diplomatic pressure from the Indonesians and the Americans, who were anxious to keep Indonesia from becoming communist-aligned, yielded and agreed to a diplomatic compromise, allowing the Indonesians to gain control of the territory in exchange for pledging to hold a self-determination plebiscite in the territory by 1969. Thus, by the close of 1962, Indonesia had achieved a considerable diplomatic victory, which possibly emboldened its self-perception as a notable regional power. It was in the context of Indonesia's recent diplomatic victory in the Netherlands New Guinea dispute that Indonesia cast its attention to the British proposal for a unified Malaysian state. Prior to the British government announcing the East of Suez policy in 1968, the British government had begun to re-evaluate in the late 1950s its force commitment in the Far East. As a part of its withdrawal from its Southeast Asian colonies, the UK moved to combine its colonies in North Borneo with the Federation of Malaya and Singapore. In May 1961, the UK and Malayan governments proposed a larger federation called Malaysia, encompassing the states of Malaya, North Borneo, Sarawak, Brunei, and Singapore. Initially, Indonesia was mildly supportive of the proposed Malaysia, although the PKI was strongly opposed to it. In Brunei, it was unclear whether the Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin III would support Brunei joining the proposed Malaysian state because of the implied reduction of his political office, and Brunei's oil revenues ensured Brunei's financial viability were it to choose independence. Furthermore, a Brunei politician, Dr. Amazahari bin Sheikh Mahmud, while supporting a unified North Borneo, also opposed a wider Malaysian federation. In 1961, he had sounded out Indonesia about possible aid in training Borneo recruits. General Abdul Nasution hinted at moral support, and Subandrio, the Indonesian foreign minister and head of intelligence, hinted at supplying more substantial aid. Azahari was a leftist who had fought in Indonesia in their war for independence. Following these meetings, Indonesia began training in Kalimantan a small volunteer force, the North Kalimantan National Army. On 8 December 1962, the TNKU staged an insurrection, the Brunei Revolt. The insurrection was an abject failure. The poorly trained and equipped forces were unable to seize key objectives such as capturing the Sultan of Brunei, seize the Brunei oil fields, or take European hostages. Within hours of the insurrection being launched, British forces based in Singapore were being mobilized for a prompt response. The failure of the insurrection was clear within 30 hours when Gurkha troops airlifted from Singapore secured Brunei town and ensured the Sultan's safety. The degree of Indonesian support for the TNKU remains a subject of debate. While Indonesia at the time denied direct involvement, it did sympathize with the TNKU's objectives to destabilize the proposed Malaysian state. Following the TNKU's military setback in Brunei, on 20 January 1963, Indonesian Foreign Minister Subandrio announced that Indonesia would pursue a policy of confrontasi with Malaysia. reversing Indonesia's previous policy of compliance with the British proposal. This was followed by the first recorded infiltration of Indonesian forces on 12 April 1963 when a police station in Tebedu, Sarawak, was attacked. People and terrain. In 1961, the island of Borneo was divided into 4 separate states. Kalimantan, comprising 4 Indonesian provinces, was located in the south of the island. In the north, separated from Kalimantan by a border some 1,000 miles long, were the Sultanate of Brunei and 2 colonies of the United Kingdom, British North Borneo and Sarawak. The 3 UK territories totaled some 1.5 million people, about half of them Dayaks. Sarawak had a population of about 900,000, while Sabah's was 600,000 and Brunei's was around 80,000. Among Sarawak's non-Dayak population, 31% were Chinese, and 19% were Malay. Among non-Dayaks in Sabah, 21% were Chinese and 7% were Malay. Brunei's non-Dayak population was 28% Chinese and 54% Malay. There was a large Indonesian population in Talwiru in southern Sabah and a large and economically active Chinese one in Sarawak. Despite their population size, Dayaks were spread through the country in village longhouses and were not politically organized. Sarawak was divided into 5 administrative divisions. Sabah, whose capital city was Jesselton on the north coast, was divided into several residencies. Those of the interior and Talwiru were on the border. Apart from either end, the border generally followed a ridgeline throughout its length, rising to almost 2,500 meters in the 5th Division. In the 1st Division, there were some roads, including a continuous road from Kuching to Brunei and around to Sandakan on the east coast of Sabah. There were no roads in the 4th and 5th Divisions or the Interior Residency, and in 3rd Division, there was only the Coast Road, which was some 150 miles from the border. Mapping was generally poor, as British maps of the country showed very little topographic detail. Indonesian maps were worse. Veterans recall a single black and white sheet for all of Kalimantan torn from a school textbook in 1964. Kalimantan was divided into 4 provinces, of which East Kalimantan and West Kalimantan face the border. The capital of the West is Pontianak on the west coast, about 100 miles from the border, and the capital of the East is Samarinda on the south coast, some 220 miles from the border. There were no roads in the border area other than some in the west, and no road existed linking West and East Kalimantan. The lack, on both sides of the border, of roads and tracks suitable for vehicles meant that movement was limited to foot tracks mostly unmarked on any map, as well as water and air movement. There were many large rivers on both sides of the border, and these were the main means of movement, including hovercraft by the UK. There were also quite a few small grass airstrips suitable for light aircraft, as dropping zones for parachuted supplies, and for helicopters. The equator lies about 100 miles south of Kuching, and most of northern Borneo receives over 3,000 millimeters of rain each year. Borneo is naturally covered by tropical rainforest. This covers the mountainous areas cut by many rivers with very steep-sided hills and hilltop ridges often only a few meters wide. The high rainfall means large rivers. These provide a main means of transport and are formidable tactical obstacles. Dense mangrove forest covering vast tidal flats intersected with numerous creeks is a feature of many coastal areas, including Brunei on either end of the border. There are cultivated areas in valleys and around villages. In the vicinity of abandoned and current settlements are areas of dense secondary regrowth. Sarawakian opposition. The end of the Second World War had brought an end to the Brooke dynasty rule in Sarawak. Believing it to be in the best interest of the people of Sarawak, Charles Vyner Brooke ceded the state to the British Crown. Sarawak became a Crown colony, ruled from the Colonial Office in London, which in turn dispatched a governor for Sarawak. The predominantly Malay anti-cession movement, which rejected the British takeover of Sarawak in 1946 and had assassinated Duncan Stewart, the first British High Commissioner of Sarawak, may have been the forerunner of the subsequent anti-Malaysia movement in Sarawak, headed by Ahmad Zaidi Idrus. According to Vernon L. Porritt and Hong Kar Fong, left-wing and communist cell groups had been present among Sarawak's urban Chinese communities since the 1930s and 1940s. Some of the earliest communist groups in Sabah included the Anti-Fascist League, which later became the Races Liberation Army, and the Borneo Anti-Japanese League, which was made up of the North Borneo Anti-Japanese League and the West Borneo Anti-Japanese League. The latter was led by Wu Chan, who was deported by the Sarawak colonial government to China in 1952. Other communist groups in Sarawak included the Overseas Chinese Youth Association, which was formed in 1946, and the Liberation League along with its youth wing, the Advanced Youth Association, which emerged during the 1950s. These organizations became the nuclei for two communist guerrilla movements: the anti-Malaysia North Kalimantan People's Army and the Sarawak People's Guerrillas. These various communist groups were designated by various British and other Western sources as the Clandestine Communist Organization or the Sarawak Communist Organization. The Sarawak Communist Organization was predominantly dominated by ethnic Chinese but also included Dayak supporters. However, the Sarawak Communist Organization had little support from ethnic Malays and other indigenous Sarawak peoples. At its height, the SCO had 24,000 members. During the 1940s and 1950s, Maoism had spread among Chinese vernacular schools in Sarawak. Following the Second World War, communist influence also penetrated the labor movement and the predominantly Chinese Sarawak United People's Party, the state's first political party, which was founded in June 1959. The Sarawak insurgency began after the Brunei Revolt in 1962, and SCO would fight alongside the Bruneian rebels and Indonesian forces during the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation. The Sarawak Communist Organization and the Bruneian rebels supported and propagated the unification of all British Borneo territories to form an independent leftist North Kalimantan state. The idea was originally proposed by A.M. Azahari, leader of the Parti Rakyat Brunei, who had forged links with Sukarno's nationalist movement, together with Ahmad Zaidi, in Java in the 1940s. However, the Brunei People's Party was in favor of joining Malaysia on the condition it was as the unified three territories of northern Borneo with their own sultan, and hence was strong enough to resist domination by Malaya, Singapore, Malay administrators or Chinese merchants. The North Kalimantan proposal was seen as a post-decolonization alternative by local opposition against the Malaysia Plan. Local opposition throughout the Borneo territories was primarily based on economic, political, historical and cultural differences between the Borneo states and Malaya, as well as the refusal to be subjected under peninsular political domination. Both Azahari and Zaidi went into exile in Indonesia during the confrontation, while the latter returned to Sarawak and had his political status rehabilitated. Azahari remained in Indonesia until his death on 3 September 2002. In the aftermath of the Brunei Revolt, the remnants of the TNKU reached Indonesia, possibly fearing British reprisals. Many Chinese communists, possibly several thousand, also fled Sarawak. Their compatriots remaining in Sarawak were known as the CCO by the UK but called the PGRS Pasukan Jalali Rakyat Sarawak by Indonesia. So Bandrio met with a group of their potential leaders in Bogor, and Nasution sent 3 trainers from Resamin Para Commando Angkatan Darat Battalion 2 to Nangabadan near the Sarawak border, where there were about 300 trainees. Some 3 months later 2 lieutenants were sent there. The PGRS numbered about 800, based in West Kalimantan at Batu Hitam. with a contingent of 120 from the Indonesian intelligence agency and a small cadre trained in China. The PKI was strongly in evidence and led by an ethnic Arab revolutionary, Soloyan. The PGRS ran some raids into Sarawak but spent more time developing their supporters in Sarawak. The Indonesian military did not approve of the leftist nature of the PGRS and generally avoided them.